Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Maria Press Professional Development Webinar Series. In today's webinar, Father Daniel P. Horan will discuss what the Church teaches about racism and our call to justice. My name is Erin Pierce. I am the Parish and Curriculum Marketing Specialist at Ave Maria Press. Everyone in the audience is muted today, but you are able to ask questions. Questions can be sent to our presenter using this webinar box here, and I'll answer as many of those questions, or I'll ask as many of those questions at the end of the presentation today. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to you via email tomorrow. With that, I would like to welcome and introduce our presenter today. Daniel P. Horan, OFM, is Director of the Center for Spirituality and Professor of Philosophy, Religious Studies, and Theology at St. Mary's College. He previously served as the Duns Scotus Professor of Spirituality at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. He is a columnist for National Catholic Reporter and the author of 13 books, including A White Catholic's Guide to Racism and Privilege, The Franciscan Heart of Thomas Merton, and Catholicity and Emerging Personhood, which received a 2020 Excellence in Publishing Award from the Association of Catholic Publishers. Horan regularly lectures around the United States and abroad and serves on a number of university, academic, and publication editorial boards, including the St. Bonaventure University Board of Trustees, the Franciscan School of Theology Board of Regents, and the Board of Directors of the International Thomas Merton Society. He is co-host of the Francis Effect podcast. Father, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks, Erin. Great to be with you and with all of our attendees.
Wonderful. I'm going to go ahead and make you presenter here. Okay, great. You can take it from here.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again, Erin, and thanks to all of you who are joining us today. This is really an honor to be with you and an important topic at hand. So given the limited amount of time we have and how precious everybody's time is, especially during the season of Advent and preparing for Christmas, I want to go ahead and get started. The first thing I want to do is just highlight, before we even talk about the subject matter, what I call some ground rules. This is really an invitation for us to kind of keep in mind, not just today as I share some information about a Catholic response to racism, but for you moving forward as you seek perhaps to educate yourself, to help share some information in your ministerial settings, parishes and schools and the like, or even, especially with an eye toward the holidays, as we gather with our families, friends, and loved ones. The first is that this is a challenging subject matter and that people will feel, respond, and process differently. And that's okay. We need to be patient with one another and especially with ourselves. We come from various social locations, different ethnic and cultural backgrounds, different racial identities, different class experiences, different educational experiences, and the like. So it's important to recognize that there's no one-size-fits-all response or expectation. The second is that trust and confidence are essential for honest conversation. This is really important because everyone should feel safe to share their perspectives when we talk about issues like this. Now, our webinar format today is really kind of one-directional, except for our Q&A toward the end. But even in that context, you should feel safe to share your perspective in your questions as Erin expertly moderates that for us and shares your feedback and your questions. But this is maybe a ground rule to take with you moving forward from this webinar in your workplaces, places of ministry, family settings, community life, and so forth. The third point I think is important for us to remember is that nobody has all the answers, myself included. We're all learners, we're all teachers here in this work of striving toward greater racial justice. As it is with all areas of justice, this is key to Catholic social teaching, as so many of you know so well. So what's required of us is recognizing we don't all have the answers, or no one has all the answers, that we need to listen actively and reflect on our responses and feelings. How are we personally, being in tune, as it were, to how we're feeling? Finally, and this is really key, I'll circle back to this toward the end of my prepared presentation, and probably find it useful to highlight in our Q&A as well, that it's okay to make quote unquote mistakes. This is complex work. Everyone will stumble, everyone will, as I like to say, goof up. How we respond to ourselves and others makes all the difference. And in the spirit of our faith, and as people of faith, I think patience is a virtue that doesn't get as much attention, especially today, as it ought to. So we're stressed out, we're nervous, we're defensive, we're uncomfortable. All of that is to be expected in difficult conversations, difficult topics. This is one of them. And so patience is really key. So let us pray both now and moving forward for the Holy Spirit's gift of patience, that we can strive to practice that habit, that virtue in all we do, and especially in this important work. So before I get into some kind of key elements here, some key topics, I want to address the sort of elephant in the room, as it were. Why am I talking about this? Why am I, a white male Franciscan friar, theologian, professor, priest? Why me? I think when a lot of people think of racism, racial justice, white privilege, white supremacy, these topics that are so important today, they think of women and men of color who are the voices, who are the ones to look to talk about this and so forth. And that is certainly true. I'm not here to speak for anybody other than myself, and from a position that I clearly identify as a white man in the United States and as a Catholic priest and Franciscan friar. But I've come to find myself more and more convinced of what we see represented in this slide here, that our sisters and brothers of color in particular have invited white people like myself, and perhaps like many of you who are joining us in this webinar or watching it afterwards, to reflect, right? This is so deeply a part of our faith tradition, an examination of conscience. I mean, for heaven's sake, we can't celebrate the Eucharist without that rite of, that penitential rite, right? The act of reflecting on what we have done and what we have failed to do. And this is the invitation, I think, that our world is inviting us, especially those who look like me, who are in a social location of whiteness, to consider that when we don't speak up, we're contributing to the problem. When we don't acknowledge, not only the injustices that are perpetrated on people of color in our communities, our faith communities, our social communities, our institutions, our schools, but also the ways in which white people unwittingly, inadvertently benefit from the very same system. If we don't take a critical lens to that, speak up, try to learn, try to seek ongoing conversion, as we say in Catholic faith, well, then we're responsible. It is, as we say in that Confiteor prayer at Mass, it is in fact a form of a sin of omission. It is what we have failed to do. I think of the author, Ijeoma Olu, who says that to white people, she puts this rather directly. She says, white people, I don't want you to understand me better. I want you to understand yourselves. Your survival has never depended, on your knowledge of white culture. In fact, it's required your ignorance. Now, there's a bold statement in many ways, but what she's getting at is what we need to do is some homework ourselves. When I say we, again, I'm talking about fellow white people like myself. That the invitation here is, in order to live out our faith, striving toward that divine justice around issues of racial inequality, racial violence in our communities and our society, what we need to do is the homework of learning about ourselves as well, how we benefit, how we participate, what our complicity is, and so forth. That's one of the reasons why I'm talking about this. This is one of the reasons why I'm here today. Another one is the grounding that I find myself having in my Catholic and Franciscan tradition. I'll say more about that as we talk about what the church says and the wisdom of church teaching and magisterial teaching on this topic. So over the years, I have found myself convicted, becoming more and more aware of the reality of racial injustice, and that it's not as simple as KKK members or neo-Nazis or self-avowed white supremacists who are part of the problem, but because we are all connected to one another in society, we are all involved in this reality, including when there is injustice. So over the years, I've written about this, I've talked about this, especially from a perspective of the Catholic teaching, our shared Catholic teaching, and from the Franciscan intellectual and spiritual tradition. And I'm here with you today because the wonderful team at Ave Maria Press invited me about a year and a half ago to think about doing something more sustained rather than one-off talks or an article or a column here and there. And that's what's resulted in the book, A White Catholic's Guide to Racism and Privilege, that Aaron is going to say a bit more about after my presentation with you today. I want to say one more thing, and that's made clear in the book. If you've read it, you see this right away in the introduction. But I have a very particular audience here, which ties back to this opening question, why am I talking about this? There are so many resources that are available to all people, whether white or not white alike. And I highly encourage you to avail yourself of all of these resources. There's so much we need to learn. And if you're a white person like me, there's a lot to learn about the experiences and about the perspective and about the instruction that comes from our sisters and brothers of color. But there is oftentimes a failure within a white community itself, and in our white Catholic community to be more particular here, to talk about issues of racial injustice unless there is a horrendous problem, or unless we're confronted with a challenge. For instance, oh, this is a racist institution, or that's a racist remark, or this is a problematic X, Y, or Z. And so one of the things I have found myself reflecting on and being challenged, particularly by my sisters and brothers of color, scholars and activists and ministers alike, is can white people do the homework themselves to be able to prepare to enter into these conversations, to be good allies, to be in solidarity with all people striving for racial justice? So the audience of the book, that's why it says A White Catholic's Guide to Racism and Privilege. As I say in my introduction, it's not that what's contained is not relevant or does not resonate or should not resonate with people who aren't white, but it's particularly aimed at those who are white and white Catholics in particular, because so infrequently do we have this conversation among ourselves. So what I'd like to do is talk about really just a few things, and it's going to be brief highlights, key themes, as it were, so that we can spend some time engaging in questions and observations. And if you feel so moved, I hope you take advantage of the book and dive more deeply into some of these topics. The first is to talk about the reality of systemic racism. The second is, what is whiteness and how does it function? The third area is Catholicism and racial justice. What does the church say? And then finally, white allyship and where might we go from here? First, the reality of systemic racism. In recent years, the persistence of racial injustice has been on the forefront of all of our minds. It's been unavoidable. Thanks to technologies like cell phone movies and video camera technology, the social media, the internet, the ability to communicate across broad spaces and times very quickly and to great audiences has raised our awareness of the persistence of injustice, of violence in our context, in our society, that's motivated by race. And so we see instances here, snapshots, the murder of unarmed people of color, kind of public displays of white supremacy, symbols and messages that are very xenophobic or exclusive, that are anti-immigrant, anti-refugee, anti-Black, and so forth, symbols of the Confederacy and of the pre-Civil War slave context in the rest. We see this on the forefront of our minds. I should say, just before I move forward, that why this is important is rooted exactly in our Catholic faith, right? If we look to the Second Vatican Council, the highest teaching that the Church has, certainly in our lifetime or in the last century, to be sure, the Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, that is Gaudium et Spes, opens very powerfully with the expression that the joys and hopes, the griefs and anxieties of women and men of this time of the world are the joys and hopes, griefs and anxieties of all the people of God. That we cannot absent ourselves, we cannot distance ourselves from these painful realities of injustice, of violence, of suffering in our midst. And therefore, we need to respond to that. Too often, though, I think many of us are raised, especially those of us who identify or are identified as white, we're led to believe that racism is maybe a rare thing, a limited thing, and the bar for its identification is quite high. This kind of racism is oftentimes described by scholars and theologians as common sense racism. What we mean by common sense racism is that one person harbors a kind of animosity or hatred or violence or exercises violence toward an individual or group of people based on the color of their skin. Now, indeed, that is an overt, clear racist action or description. However, it's not sufficient to describe the reality of our society and of our institutions, of our communities. As I say here on the slide, racism is more than a conscious, deliberate exercise of racially motivated animus. It's not enough for somebody like myself to say, well, I don't support the Ku Klux Klan. I don't support redlining when it comes to housing practices. I don't support, an unjust legal system, for instance, that is disproportionately negative or disadvantageous to persons of color. So therefore, I don't use racial slurs. I don't discriminate in my workplace or my ministry or in my classroom or what have you, and therefore I'm not part of this thing we call racism. Instead, what we come to realize when we look more clearly and we listen to the reality before us, racism is about power relations. It's about structures and institutions, laws, and culture based on skin color. More on that as we go. These might be images familiar to you that we would clearly identify as common sense racism: legal segregation, right? Hate groups and organizations, violence perpetrated against people because of the color of their skin. But we need to identify cultures and systems beyond these discrete acts of overt racism or common sense racism. How is it that the laws that we have in our country affect various populations and do so differently? How is it that economic opportunities, economic justice, which is another really central part of our Catholic social doctrine and something that the US bishops have been real leaders in over the decades, right? How does this play out in our midst, and how are we involved in this, right? Each of us, regardless of our social location, though different, participate in these cultures and systems because we are all here, right? And I'm speaking, if we have folks visiting us either live or through the recording from other countries, I don't mean to exclude you, because everybody has different histories and relationships to structural forms of injustice. But here, I want to focus primarily on the US context. I think we need to focus on how is there something beyond these discrete acts of animus. And we also have to think about power. There's a difference between discrimination and racism, right? And usually the way we talk about this is kind of in a three-tiered way. There's prejudice, there's discrimination, and then there's racism. Prejudice is just as the term etymologically suggests, is a preferential option or a kind of preferential rejection based on preconceived bias or even preconscious bias, right? Everybody has prejudices. If you like mint chocolate chip ice cream better than strawberry ice cream, you have a prejudice for or in favor of mint chocolate chip. And in and of itself, having that preference or a prejudice towards something or against something, I'll be honest with you, I don't care for mushrooms. That's not a food that I enjoy. I'm kind of prejudiced against mushrooms when I have a choice at the salad bar, for instance. That's a form of prejudice, and people can have prejudices and biases of all sorts, right? That's in some sense inescapable. The question there is, are we conscious of our prejudices and what informs them? That's something for us to discern, to examine, to reflect on. If we take those prejudices and act on them, that's what leads to discrimination. So if I have prejudice against a particular ethnic group or particular gender or a particular racial identity, and I refuse service or I treat people differently because of that prejudice, that's a form of discrimination. When you take discrimination and prejudice and you insert power, and by power I mean the ways to enforce, to reinscribe, to concretize some of those prejudices and forms of discrimination, that's racism. And what I say here about reverse racism, quote unquote, is that in the US context, there's no such thing as reverse racism, because the ways in which, especially through our history, certain people have suffered the consequences of prejudice and discrimination through law, through society, sadly, even at times through our religious communities and churches, this has been one directional. It doesn't work the same way collectively. Now, that doesn't mean, I'll say this right from the outset, it doesn't mean that a person of color, a black man, for instance, may not like white people. That is certainly a form of prejudice, and maybe within his own context, he might exercise a form of discrimination. That's not okay, right? Discrimination in any form, as the church teaches, is sinful. However, it's not racism, because the whole structure, the whole history of our context, of our society, of our communities does not back up that individuals exercise of discrimination or prejudice. Now, I'm doing not full justice to all of these factors, mostly for the sake of time, but I'll be happy to talk about this some more in the Q&A as they come up. The second thing is I want to talk about whiteness and how it functions. What does it mean to be white? Part of this reality of systemic or structural injustice, particularly around racism, as I've been talking about it, is that we who identify or are identified as white, like myself, rarely, if ever, ask this question: what does it mean to be white? Do we recognize that we also have a race or a racialized identity? That whiteness is something that is part of our experience, in as much as blackness is the part of somebody who is African American's experience. A lot of white people don't recognize their own racial identity because it's presumed to be normative. I'm going to say more about that in a minute. It's considered the standard against which other things in our society are judged, valued, and understood. That's what we mean by systemic racism, right? Or structural racism. There was a book that came out in the late 50s called Black Like Me by the author John Howard Griffin, who, a white man in the South, who through medication darkened the color of his skin and lived in the Deep South for several weeks, at least as he was perceived, as he was presented as a black man, and wrote this book about his experience. Now, there's a lot we can say more than half a century later about how there are some real problems here. Number one is, why did a white person feel like they had to present themselves in the world as a black person in order to believe the experiences that black women and men have been saying to white people for generations about how they're treated, and what the difference between being in a city, as John Howard Griffin was, like New Orleans in the mid 20th century, as a white man, was very different from being in New Orleans as a black man, what he had access to, how he was treated, the risk of violence that he was presented with, and so forth. It's a very powerful and captivating book, but I bring it up almost as a cautionary tale, that you don't have to do that to go through the same experience he did in order to hear and learn from the experiences of others. So that's one lesson I want to highlight. Another one is the question still stands. And one of the things he came to learn through that admittedly extreme experience was that whiteness is a racial identity, and it is what we call a social construct. Whiteness is, in the US context, perceived as normative, the standard, the default. And whiteness is, as scholars have sometimes described, a form of property, a property that John Howard Griffin, when he darkened his skin to appear as an African American in the US South, lost. It was a property he no longer had or could rely on. More on each of these in a second. First, whiteness as a social construct. I mean, what does it mean to be white? This is the question. White people like me, are raised and socialized, we're taught, we're entertained, we're informed by a system that casts doubt on the existence of white racialization or outright denies it. That's where white people don't have race, quote unquote, in the eyes of many or in the experience of many. Other people, right? There's this othering that goes on. But the truth is, all racial identities are constructed socially. What I mean by that is, insofar as particular meaning or value is assigned to arbitrary features of an object, person, or whole community. The fact that one person is treated one way because they have darker skin than another person is entirely arbitrary. That's not God designed, that's not natural law, that's something that is socially agreed upon, not always in verbal ways or in concrete legal ways, though our country sadly has a history of that, right? We cannot deny the reality of chattel slavery. We cannot deny the reality of Jim Crow segregation. We cannot deny the reality of unarmed Black people being killed disproportionately by law enforcement and others, as we see in the Ahmaud Arbery, a case in Georgia by just people on the street, as it were. But the valuation of these characteristics is purely a social fabrication. There's no biological or genetic, scientific, or other or merit that supports it. And we can see the consequences. There's a great book by the Pulitzer Prize winning journalist and historian Isabel Wilkerson called Caste, in which she says maybe we need to stop thinking about an either or way of understanding race in the history of the United States and in our own experience today. Maybe we need to use the language of caste, the kind of stratification of valuation, of value assigned based on one's appearance. So that does anti-Latinx or anti-Hispanic racism play a role in this society, or anti-Asian racism? How does that fit into all of this, right? It varies differently depending on one's social location or identity. The Princeton historian, Professor Painter, says that race is an idea, not a fact. Constructions of whiteness have changed over time, she reminds us, shifting to accommodate the demands of social change. Before the 19th century, the existence of more than one white race was commonly accepted in popular culture and scholarship. And here, of course, she's referring to the experiences of many communities that today are identified as white. I come from a family, both sides of my family are Irish, overwhelmingly Irish. And in the 19th century, and certainly before that in North America, or what is today North America, for a period of time, the Irish were not recognized as, quote, white. Similar with Eastern European Jews in the 19th and early 20th century. So there are people who are admitted into this thing called whiteness over time. It shifts, it changes. And the fact that that happens should be a signal to us that this is not something rooted, for instance, in biology, but rather how value is assigned to perceptions or appearances, and what the result of that means for how we relate to one another and understand ourselves. That second point, whiteness as normative, whiteness as an identity marker, as a cultural metonym, as a kind of whiteness to summarize culture collectively, is viewed within a white supremacist or a racist culture as neutral or acceptable, ordinary, the default or the ideal. What does that mean? It's kind of a wordy way of saying this. What it means is that white people, like myself, are socialized to believe implicitly, if not always consciously, right? I'm not always aware of this, that our identities, perspectives, and cultures are simply the norm or default, that it's the way things ought to be. You might think, if you're white like me, you might think of experiences or times where maybe you yourself were exposed to a different kind of music or food or cultural expression like dance or art or form of liturgical worship, right? St. John Paul II talked a lot about the importance, the necessity of enculturated liturgy, which is why you can Google pictures of His Holiness, now St. John Paul II, when he traveled in places, various countries in Africa or countries throughout Asia or in North America and parts of Europe, where oftentimes he would wear, even in the liturgy, a headdress or there would be liturgical dance that was reflective of the community, all as a form of prayer and worship to God. But people who understand whiteness as normative, the way that white people in their culture express music and art and liturgy as the way things, quote, ought to be, view those expressions as not legitimate, as other, as lesser than. And this dynamic of whiteness presumed to be normative affects everything from representation in entertainment. Think back to just not that long ago in the 1990s, how many sitcoms on TV featured casts that were not, extremely white. There's been a lot of kind of revival with the younger generation today with streaming services, right? Going back to shows that were popular like Friends and other programs. And, it's startling today, even if you're not consciously looking for this, to see how undiverse that those casts are and how those stories are represented. But we see this as well with clothing and grooming styles, to colloquialisms and other forms of communication. I think about this in my context of higher education. What is considered acceptable or normative? We might ask the same question in secondary education or primary schools or in our parishes and dioceses. The last thing I want to highlight is this concept of whiteness as property that John Howard Griffin experienced the loss of as he presented himself as a Black man in the US South. Professor Cheryl Harris coined this term in some of her research many decades ago. In a brief way, we can say here, she says, whiteness defined the legal status of a person as slave or free. White identity conferred tangible and economically valuable benefits, and it was jealously guarded as a valued possession, allowed only to those who met a strict standard of proof. Whiteness, the right to white identity as embraced by the law, is property if by property one means all of a person's legal rights. I'll speak from my own experience. I wrote an article shortly after Mr. Arbery was murdered in Georgia when he was out for a jog. He was just out for a run. A black man in his mid-20s who's just out there exercising. Something that I do. That's one of my favorite hobbies. I've been a long distance runner for my entire adult life, and I've traveled all over the world and all over the United States in cities I've not been familiar with. I've run in neighborhoods I did not know. I've been in all kinds of places. And it occurred to me that I've never felt threatened in the way that led to Mr. Arbery's death. And so, what does that mean? That means that even when I'm just in my jogging clothes and I'm out for a run, maybe in downtown Philadelphia, or when I lived for a summer in Bolivia, or if I'm traveling to a place like New Zealand, where I've had the privilege to speak and to minister, or to Europe or other country or other places in the U.S., that I carry with me certain benefits that are tied to the way I'm perceived or viewed by those around me, even those in places where I am not, familiar or would otherwise not have a sense of belonging. That is a sense of property that my being identified as a white person carries with me certain privileges, which leads me to this phrase we hear oftentimes, right? White privilege. What does this mean? The term white privilege really goes back to the 1980s with Professor Peggy McIntosh, who taught women and gender studies in Wellesley College in Massachusetts. And she tells of the fact that she, for so much of her career, was trying to help women and men in particular to see the ways in which sexism and misogyny exists in all kinds of ways, not just with abusive spouses, for instance, right, or neglectful male parents or what have you, but in systems. And we can see this sadly even today when we think about the gap in pay wage, right? On average, women make less, than men doing the exact same thing, right? Sometimes as much as 60% or 80% on the dollar, right? And so she realized that maybe she benefited, though she did not benefit from what we might call male privilege, like in that financial way I just mentioned. She did perhaps benefit from something she identified as white privilege as a white woman. And she asked herself, what are the things that I experience that my colleagues of color, other professors, even at the university, would not be able to take for granted? So she says, here's just a few examples. She has more than 60 of them that she published. One is, if I can, if I wish, arrange to be in the company of people of my race most of the time. When I am told about our national heritage or about, quote, civilization, I am shown that people of my color made it what it is. I am never asked to speak for all the people in my racial group. I can choose blemish covers or bandages, band-aids as it were, in, quote, flesh color at the store and have them more or less match my skin. Now, some people have understandably rejected or felt uncomfortable or confused by the language white privilege. Privilege sounds like you get something, hence my, large wallet here. That it's not my large wallet, but you get the idea. This picture of a large wallet. In fact, I'm reminded of, speaking of the 90s and a very white cast, the TV show Seinfeld. George Costanza in one episode famously had this very chunky wallet, right, filled with business cards and all kinds of nonsense. We think of things one gets. Oh, privilege is you get a bonus, you get an extra, it's more than, right? One way I think we might better think about this is as a plow. Whiteness, being identified as white, being white in the US context, means that there's a certain sort of set of hurdles, of obstacles that you don't have to encounter, that I don't have to encounter. So if you, and that's what the image on the right is, having grown up in upstate New York, I'm used to feet and feet of snow. Can you get through the snow that hasn't been shoveled or plowed? Yeah, you can, but it's not easy. It requires struggle, it's uncomfortable, it's dangerous, right? You suffer along the way, but you might get there. It's a lot harder. So imagine two tracks or two lanes of road where you have a plow or a snowblower in front of you. And that is what the metaphor here is about whiteness. The things that Peggy McIntosh talked about, these are things she didn't have to think about. They were plowed or cleared away before her. And I know, as I'm being honest with myself in an examination of conscience and reflection on my life, I know what that feeling is like. The question is, do we assume that our experience, if your experience is like mine, is the same as everybody else's? That's the invitation. Father Brian Massengale and so many others have often pointed out that racism is a white problem. The question is, why doesn't anything seem to change? And he says that the role of white power, the culture of white supremacy, our socialization and implicit bias, all these things come together to suggest that there's a responsibility white people have, people like myself. That's why I'm here giving this webinar and inviting us to reflect deeply on this and from the wisdom here of others as well. Father Massengale talks about racism as a soul sickness. As people of faith, we know that it's more than just a social reality or a cultural problem, but it's a matter of faith, a matter of conscience, a matter of spirituality. He has, very interestingly, there was an interview Father Massengale gave with, I believe it was Commonweal magazine back maybe a year ago or so. And this question, why doesn't anything seem to change, was raised. And he said very directly, he said, it's because white people haven't wanted it to change or haven't bothered to care, something Pope Francis oftentimes talks about, right? The sin of indifference. What he means by that, and he says very, very pointedly, if racism was a black problem or a problem for other people of color, it would have been changed a long time ago. Something to think about, to pray with. There are these other ways that things kind of that get in the way, what's sometimes called white fragility, that state where fellow white people are uncomfortable. We get defensive, we get unsure, we get aggressive when we hear about some of these realities, or white rage, which elicits a kind of sense of anger in response. There's more to say about this, but I'm mindful of time. We also see these realities persisting around us. Sometimes things have not changed very much. When we look at the world today, when people stand up and say, things are not the way they ought to be. And here I think of the Hebrew prophets in the Old Testament, right? Each one of them whose life is threatened, whose experience is incredibly painful and filled with suffering. Why? Because they dare to stand up and say, God is not okay with the way we are living, the way we treat one another. These images are very powerful and disturbing at times because the question is, well, who's in charge? Who pushes back? Where is the power coming from? Let's talk a bit about Catholicism, about our faith tradition. One thing we need to understand is that the structural and institutional character of racism and white supremacy move beyond just the secular world, as it's sometimes called. Again, I invoke the Second Vatican Council, our church's highest teaching, and that pastoral constitution, which is titled The Church in the Modern World. This recognition that though we aspire to something else and that there's something truly divine that takes place within our faith community, we are nonetheless still part of society and the church, and we do not have kind of separate realities, separate identities, exchange of our souls, as it were, when we enter the church that we return when we leave. We are one person, right? We are integrated in this way. And so the fact that the church is made up of women and men in the modern world means that we are affected by the societies in which we find ourselves, sometimes very well and positively, and sadly, in the case of racial injustice and racial discrimination, in very negative ways. Therefore, the church is no exception. I think of the late great Cardinal Avery Dulles, who was a professor of theology at Fordham University for so many years. He wrote a very important book of ecclesiology, which is the study or theology of the church, in which he proposed different models, different ways of us to think about characteristics of the church. And one of them is the church as institution. We cannot deny that the church is also an institution. And in this way, we are affected by the same sorts of injustices and challenges before us. In 1968, the National Black Catholic Clergy Caucus, so Black bishops, priests, and deacons, put out a statement in which they say, and this, again, think of that white fragility. If you're white like me, I invite you to please let this seep in before responding so aggressively at first, because I know it's very strong language. But our brother priests and bishops and deacons who are African American said that the Catholic Church in the United States, primarily a white racist institution, has addressed itself primarily to white society and is definitely part of that society. I want to unpack that in a minute in three ways. First, the church, as I've been saying, is in the modern world. What does it mean to say that the church is a, quote, white racist institution, as these priests and bishops and deacons did? Well, it's what I said a moment ago, that the church is composed of people who are socialized, educated, reared, formed in a society in which they exist. That's true in the United States. It's true in every other culture and country. Therefore, the church is also affected by these same dynamics. We can't pretend it isn't. The second is that there's a collective and uncritical appropriation of white normativity. General assumptions that white or European or American images, depictions, music, liturgy, dress, and culture are genuinely and generally authentically Catholic and only authentically Catholic is a form of that leads to kind of a white racist identity or experience. And then there is, as the late great historian Father Cyprian Davies, a Benedictine monk and professor for many years at Mundelein University, says, the denial and erasure of Black Catholic identity and history. He says, too often the presence of Black Catholics through the centuries has been a muted one, a silent one, an unspoken testimony. Especially those of us who are white Catholics, we're not often aware of the fact that there's a long history of Black Catholicism, one that predates the foundation of the United States and has been here from the very beginning. You know, I was speaking with a vice president for diversity, equity, and inclusion at a large Catholic university in the United States. We were at a conference together and we were speaking, and she talked about how often she gets asked the question, when did you become Catholic? And she said, I guess the minute I was baptized as a baby, that she came from a Catholic family, that she was raised Catholic. But the assumption that Black Catholics are exceptional or only converts is a form of this denial and erasure that Father Davis highlights, and something I think we should all be aware of and think about. So what does the church say in its teaching about racial justice? Well, first, let's take a look at the Vatican and international statements. And again, these are just really bullet points, highlights. Going all the way back to Pope Pius XI in 1937, he wrote about the sin of racism, and he specifically addressed the evil of the rising Nazi racism and anti-Semitism in Europe at the time. Vatican II, we've already talked about 1965. There's a universal condemnation of prejudice, including the prejudice and discrimination based on race. St. John Paul II, he delivered multiple statements, including many times here on our soil in the United States, where he called out not only the evils of the history of racism in our past, but also the persistence and its effects in our present. And in particular, I think about statements in 1988 when he talked also about South Africa and apartheid, and in 1999 when he visited the United States and tied our history of racism to the injustices of our criminal justice system and the persistence of the evil of capital punishment, which of course disproportionately affects people of color. Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI, when he was Bishop of Rome, Deus Caritas Est, also in an Angelus address in 2008, decries what he calls disturbing new forms of racism. And of course, most recently, Pope Francis, in his encyclical letter Fratelli Tutti just last year, as well as in numerous statements, refers to racism as a virus. And he has spoken in support of social movements and protests in favor of working toward racial justice. There are bishop conferences from around the world, Catholic communities that in many ways are very, very much ahead of us in the US, that offer very clear, direct, honest assessments of the reality of racism and its impact. And I think we in the United States can learn a lot. These documents are widely available, many of them on the internet, but the bishops of India, the bishops of South Africa, the bishops of the United Kingdom, for example. Our own brother bishops here in the United States have offered over the course of about the last century or so, give or take, century and 20 years, 4 different statements on racism. The 2 most recent were in 1979 and 2018, but they're imperfect. There's a lot more to say about that, but the key thing here is that the takeaway, even though there's room for improvement, is that the bishops, like the popes, like the Second Vatican Council, like the church leaders in other parts of the world, our bishops in the US have said that this is a sin, this is evil, this is something that we need to attend to. It is a matter of faith. It is not an add-on. It is not a, quote, Marxist scheme or these other things that people will try to say in order to avoid facing the reality. This is a matter of faith. It is, as Father Massengale says, a soul sickness. So let me wrap up by just highlighting a couple things here, and really very, very briefly, just to highlight basic themes of good allyship for people who look like me, fellow white Catholics, um, and all of us, I would hope, but in particular. First, to recognize the significance of your social location. The fact that we have a white racial identity is not insignificant. It isn't neutral. It isn't normative, but rather it has certain implications, both positive and negative. What does that mean? I think the second thing is to be a good ally requires, as we've been told by our sisters and brothers of color, that we need humility and a commitment to relearning a lot of what we thought we knew. So one very easy example of this is thinking that racism is merely for the KKK or for legal segregation or enslavement of people of color or using racial slurs or that sort of thing. Yes, that's a form of common sense racism, but we need to relearn that it's more complex and that we play a role in all of this. The third, and by being part of this webinar or watching the recording, you're doing this already to educate yourself, to listen to the wisdom and experience of others, especially that wisdom, experience, and challenge of our sisters and brothers of color. Can we do that with open hearts, right? Open minds. Can we also develop a spirituality of ongoing conversion? To be a Christian is not a one-time, one-off thing. We don't just decide to do it and then it's over with. We are called to ongoing conversion, right? We stumble, we fail, we reconcile, we do penance, we move forward, but we learn and we don't stop, right? It's ongoing, and we do it as a community. I'd like to recommend another book in addition to mine, and this is actually from the Mennonite tradition, but I think it's very timely. It's distinctive in its own right because of the spiritual nature of this. What does it mean to pursue an anti-racist spirituality? So these two professors, Regina Stoltzfus and Tobin Miller Shearer, a black woman and a white man, have been doing anti-racist education work for Christian communities since the 90s. And in this book, they talk about what they've learned about being people of faith, being Christians who are seeking an anti-racist spirituality, doing exactly that, developing an experience of ongoing conversion. And then the last thing I want to say is that we're called to do the work. What begins with education and awareness ought to lead to action and implementation. And we do it at all kinds of levels. We do it at the personal level and in our friends' circles. We do it at the family level. As the holiday season is upon us with Thanksgiving and now Advent, Christmas, and the New Year, when we interact with one another and we hear things that are perhaps inappropriate or inaccurate or maybe commonsensically racist or maybe subtly so, do we speak up in a loving way, of course, in a patient way? Do we try to help one another learn and grow from our experiences, or do we just stay silent? Do we act in a form of omission? Something for us to think about. We also can work the local, our campus, our church, our community levels, our school levels. And there are lots of ways we can do that. And maybe there'll be time in the Q&A to talk about that. And then, of course, at the national and international levels, how do we advocate for greater racial justice? How do we advocate for what it is that God is calling us to, which is to be co-laborers in the vineyard of the Lord, to be those who announce by our deeds and by our words the inbreaking of God's kingdom, a kingdom of peace, a kingdom of justice. So I thank you for your patience. I thank you for the opportunity to share some of these insights with you, and I look forward to our conversation. And I think with that, I'm going to share back this with Erin. So thank you, everyone.
Yes. Thank you so much, Father. I give you an opportunity here to take a breath and maybe a drink of water as we invite our attendees to submit questions to you. Thank you so much for all of this information, for your sensitivity to all of this, of course, and really an opportunity for all of us to grow as brothers and sisters and to be better citizens to one another. So I invite anybody to submit questions, as I mentioned, in the box here. What would you say to someone who struggles, and I know you touched upon it a little bit, of the white privilege, right? Somebody being white might think, I've worked hard for everything that I have accomplished in my life. might you say in response?
Yeah, I think that's a very common response. So, Aaron, that's a great question. One thing that I think as people of faith, we are really called to be aware of is our interdependence and interrelatedness. Something Benedict the XVI and Pope Francis have both really highlighted. Pope Francis, especially with care for creation, right? That we don't do anything truly on our own. And it's something St. Paul talks about in the letter to the Romans. We're called to build one another up. We're called, by virtue of baptism, we're united to one another in the Spirit through Christ Jesus. So we never do anything by ourselves. So when people say, well, what does this mean because I'm white, that I've had it a little bit easier? Is that what you're suggesting? Especially if I've experienced financial struggle or if I've experienced some other kind of form of discrimination or oppression? What the first thing I would often say is, in addition to those points about our starting perspective as people of faith in the gospel, is to say that this is not a competition to see who has suffered the most. Sometimes it can become that. People will say, well, I'm a white person, but I'm a poor person, or I'm a white person, but I'm a woman in a man's world, or I'm a white person in X. It's not to deny or erase the struggles that people face. The issue is to take an honest look at maybe that snowplow image. So I really appreciate the question. I think I've grown more and more to recognize that the language of privilege is not so helpful because it's hard to overcome that. It sounds like, well, everything I got was handed to me.
Mhm.
And that's not the claim. The claim is, I think, what are the things one didn't have to deal with? So I think about this often. Now, this may be a scandal to those of us on the webinar, but I know as a friar and as a priest, it's hard to believe, but I have occasionally been pulled over by a police officer when driving. And usually it's my fault. I'm not paying attention and I'm going too fast on the highway or something like this. I shouldn't say usually, it's always my fault. It's usually not intended, is what I mean to say. But especially in what's become to light through cell phone videos and the witness of the disproportionate harm that's caused by people of color by law enforcement. Again, law enforcement have really difficult jobs. We should have respect for police officers and first responders, but they are human like all of us are and are affected by these dynamics like everybody is. Nevertheless, what are the realities before us? One reality is I have never, when I've been pulled over, thought I'm going to die just because of the color of my skin. And that's something that snowplow image has cleared away from me. That it's not something I earned. It's not something I asked for. I think that's another thing to remember is that if we use the language of privilege or plow or something else, what we're talking about here is unwitting, which means it is unearned. I didn't do anything to get that right, not to be afraid of dying,
Mhm.
but it's not something I asked for either, right? And so I think at times people get defensive in that way. And my invitation is much like when people heard Jesus, say things like turn the other cheek or say things like let those without sin cast the first stone, and people got really angry, really defensive, is to say, Holy Spirit, come into my heart, give me some patience here. I need to think about this and not let that defensiveness kind of lead the way.
Absolutely. I really think that that image of a plow is very effective. I like that a lot. Okay, we got some questions coming in here. How do we bring this topic up in a parish, especially when the older white community has trouble accepting newer immigrants of color? Or
That's such a great question. I think it depends on what your responsibility is in the parish, and there are different ways that can be done. So a lot of parishes have, and I think this would be the easiest starting point. Sort of justice and peace committees or committees that are focused on life issues. And I think we easily, when we think about the pro-life ministry in our parish or our diocese, we think abortion, euthanasia, capital punishment. But I think we need to recognize that racism is a life issue. 100% a life issue. It's a matter of life and death. And so I think that's an opportunity, for those committees who are thinking of programming, thinking of reading groups, thinking of, maybe a movie that they're going to show and have a discussion group or invite a speaker. Can those groups offer programming and ongoing adult formation, adult education, in that area that takes into consideration the reality of racism in an honest and in a patient and in a faithful way? I think another thing is if you're the pastor or one of the parochial ministers, you know, maybe it's not always appropriate in a liturgical preaching setting to talk about issues. I think that's a true across the board, including some of the issues I brought up earlier. It's not always appropriate to talk about euthanasia or to talk about abortion or to talk about racial justice in every homily. But there are times throughout our liturgical year where it's especially important. I think, for instance, it's important on Good Friday to acknowledge the persistence of the evil of capital punishment because we're recognizing the murder by the state of our Lord and Savior. I think likewise, it's important during Black History Month or maybe the Sunday before Martin Luther King Day, which is a federal holiday in the United States, to say, or when we enter into Black Catholic History Month in the fall, which is in November in the U.S. Catholic Church. These are times where, pastors and pastoral ministers can incorporate that. But I think, I'm often fond of reminding people, including my students, that, no one is more or less Catholic than one another. This may be shocking to some, but Pope Francis is no more Catholic than the latest baptized baby last Sunday. It's just a matter of fact. We have different roles in the kingdom of God and in the church. What I mean by that is we are all equal members in this faith community. And so maybe we don't have to look to kind of a top-down approach. If this is something that you're passionate about and something you feel the Spirit tugging at your conscience and heart, which is what we are called to acknowledge, right? To examine our conscience. Start a reading group, or start a film watching group, or a conversation discussion group, or get involved in an ecumenical sense. Maybe there are in your local community other parishes, other churches, Christian and non-Christian alike, who are also fired by the Spirit or energized by their faith commitments to address some of these topics and to learn more. Maybe your parish isn't the place or isn't interested or doesn't have the resources to host some of these things. Get involved in some of these others. I think that's also in the spirit of our faith community. So lots of different ways, but I think it can be daunting. It can be intimidating, like a lot of topics. I think starting anywhere, starting somewhere is important, but I think that will vary depending on your responsibility in the parish.
Absolutely. Thank you. Um, there's quite a few questions coming in around that same topic. Somebody said, and you mentioned this in your book, that sometimes a priest wouldn't want to address things from the pulpit because they don't want to get too political,
Yeah.
right? Yes. So that's what some have experienced here. They're sharing.
Well, and I
Here's
might,
a
if I may, just
yeah,
respond to that and
yeah.
say, it's no more or less political than the other life issues that are regularly preached from the AMBO every Sunday. At appropriate, God willing, at appropriate times, right? I think it would be
Mhm.
there, as I mentioned, there are appropriate and inappropriate times, but there people being treated with unjustly because of the color of their skin is as much a life issue as people being treated unjustly because of when they're conceived or born, with their age or ability, or the fact that they've committed a crime. These things, I'm thinking of capital punishment in particular, these are all life issues. I guess you can't, if you think talking about the reality of racism in our society is too political to be preached from the pulpit, then I guess that same parish is not hearing anything about these other issues.
That's a good point. Another question here. What has the church done recently to acknowledge the church's stance on racism? Slavery was blessed by the church. Many left religious life due to being formed in a white culture. Some practical steps that could be done?
Yeah. So I think, somebody I think of in this vein who models well for us is John Paul II. When he was Pope, he I'm trying to remember the year, so forgive me. I think it was the Jubilee Millennium year of 2001, where on Good Friday in the famous grand intercessions, right? You have these important global intercessions. He made a very powerful statement where he apologized on behalf of the church as institution for things like our role in anti-Semitism and the violence of people of other religions, of enslavement, these kinds of things. I think there's a place for lament. I think there's a place where at the local level we can have liturgies. Wouldn't it be powerful to have maybe come January around the Martin Luther King holiday, or in February during Black History Month in the United States, to have maybe a Vesper service have evening prayer as a faith community, maybe on a Sunday night or a weekday night or what have you, where within the context of prayer we have reflections and maybe some prayers that focus on acknowledging that we as a faith community have been involved in some of these really their tragedies, their sins, their crimes, and in many ways, I think one answer is not to avoid our history, not to avoid the reality, because in doing that, we lock ourselves out of learning from it to begin with. But there's also a denying of the real pain and the consequences that continue to persist. So I think, if that sounds like something that's of interest to you, I think, that's something to pursue. And if somebody gives you some resistance and says, well, that again, to your Aaron, great point about like, oh, that's too political, you say, well, St. John Paul II did the exact same thing, or our Holy Father Pope Francis does this very regularly, and you can look at lines in Fratelli Tutti where he talks about racism and it being a virus. It's interesting. He pairs that with the coronavirus and says there are other viruses too, and racism is one of them. It keeps mutating. Isn't that disturbing with the Omicron situation we had before us? That racism, just because we don't have legal slavery anymore, doesn't mean that racism is gone. It's mutated. That's a powerful image there. And I
Mm.
think there's a place for lament. There's a place for prayer. There's a place for liturgy.
Yes. Oh, wow. All right. Well, thank you so much. I know I want to respect everyone's time also. This has been really so informative and challenging, but also I think, I hope, hopeful too, that people are ready, white people especially, are ready to make some changes as they can. So we would invite you to, if you want to see more about Father Dan's book, we offer 25% off using code webinar 1214 when ordering at AveMariaPress.com, as well as your previous book with us, The Franciscan Heart of Thomas Merton. So thank you all, everyone, Father Dan, everyone, for being with us today. And we invite you to join us next week, next Tuesday. Deacon Harold Burke Sivers is going to share with us the role of deacons in parish life. So we hope that you join us for that. Thank you all so much. Have an excellent week, and we hope to see you next Tuesday.
Blessed
Bye-bye.
Advent and Christmas, everyone. Yeah.
Thank you.